I don't actually remember a time when I wasn't haunted by Biafra as a subject. My grandfather died in the war, and I grew up with stories of how wonderful my grandfather was. And there's a beautiful faded black and white photograph of him that I would look at very often. And so as a child, I knew that the reason my grandfather was not there was because he had died in Biafra during the war. And I just knew that I would write about it. In some ways, I felt almost as though I didn't have a choice, that I had to write about it. But then it took me a while to feel ready. When I was 15, I wrote a play about the war, which was a terrible play that I hope nobody ever sees. And then I wrote a short story, and then I wrote another short story before I felt confident enough to start the novel. So for me, one of the most, actually the most magical thing about writing fiction is that sometimes characters take on a life of their own and do things that you don't necessarily want them to do. And every time I say this to people who don't write, they look at me like I'm crazy, but it is true. And so with Half of a Yellow Sun, I kind of had an idea of what would happen with the characters. And at some point in the writing process, the characters became defiant. And one character who I thought would die refused to die. So the story changed in a sort of in an unconscious way and in a creative way. Well, the one thing to say about my writing process is how just utterly lacking in glamour it is. Much as I would like to invent this sort of, I would like to say that I practice yoga and I light a red candle. But the truth is that I just sit at my table and alternately get depressed and hopeful. No, but I usually am a very, I think it's fair to say that I am a bit obsessive with writing, and so I don't like to let people see things until I have done many rounds of edits. And with Half of a Yellow Sun, actually my editor at the time, this wonderful woman called Mitzi, who was in London, I'd sent her something and I said, actually Mitzi, I want it back because I don't think it's ready. And Mitzi said, Chimamanda, it's ready, let it go. And so I had to. So for me, it's, I actually looking at the novel now, there are things I want to change. So I'm constantly editing, constantly dissatisfied. I did a lot of reading. I tried to read everything that had been published about Biafra at the time. I spent a lot of time in archives. I listened to radio broadcasts. I, watched newsreels, spent a lot of time in libraries. And so I felt that the books gave me the facts of the war, but I wanted the truths as well. And so I also spent a lot of time interviewing people. My father was really the center of this book. So I talked to my father endlessly about the war, but also my other relatives and some friends of my father's who lived through the war. And so often I would ask them to humanize some of the things I had read about in the history books. So I would say, well, this happened, for example, the Ahira Declaration, tell me what you had for breakfast that morning, if you had breakfast. And that's the way that I think one gets that kind of textured stories that fiction requires. I'm not sure I know what other writers do. Right? I mean, I feel like, and I sometimes suspect that we make up things, right? When we talk about I don't know. But maybe if I had to say something about being different from other writers, I think I assume, and I have read about writers who talk about sort of channeling depression and pain into writing and writing during dark times. And I am completely unable to write during dark times. So I just wasn't blessed with that ability.